Greetings, friends. I'm Arnold Schroeder, and this is Fight Like an Animal, the podcast where we cite research on crack dealers, how childhood trauma affects brain structure, and the social developmental context of elephants, and relate it all to Civil War. That was the last episode. And that bibliography, which I am particularly proud of, among my many, I think, fairly eclectic bibliographies, which demonstrate a considerable penchant for synthesis. I'm particularly proud of the elephants, what elephants can teach us about Civil War bibliography. So if you want to find that bibliography, it's at againsttheinternet.com. There is no bibliography for this episode, really, but I am basing this largely on reading a text that can be found at the website. And, you know, follow me on Twitter, tell all your friends, rate and review the podcast. These are some of the things that I've learned to say as a master of podcast promotion. So I'm gonna listen to this once I've slept and see if this is really the kind of thing that I want to give to the world. I probably shouldn't be doing this episode right now in the state that I'm in. I'm radically underslept, but I'm driving to Portland tomorrow, and I'll be there for a few days doing things other than making podcasts, and it's just been a little too long. As always, I have a little bit of trouble predicting my own output. I thought that this episode wasn't something I saw coming anytime particularly soon, and I have a bunch of other episodes that are essentially done or very, very close to being ready to record, that for some reason I have just set aside to do this, and that's life. But what I'm talking about today relies heavily on my actual experience organizing, and I would say that this will be one of the least explicitly we'll be centering our inquiry in biology or psychology, anything explicitly related to that. But although we will talk about evolved psychological needs in human nature and whether our civilization accommodates it in the course of talking about these policies, because, whatever illustrates the point that you actually can't escape this stuff when you're just trying to do concrete policy work, or you're trying to do direct action. You're trying to achieve some outcome in the external world. This stuff about variation in assessments of human nature, or the willingness to even engage with the idea of human nature at all, which of course is a logical prerequisite for assessing variations in people's estimates of what human nature is. These things really actually totally fucking matter in a huge way toward in terms of real world situations with significant outcomes. So we're going to talk about my components of a model political program for ecological survival. That's the title of the piece.
Where you going, kid?
Get a drink of water.
Here, sit down. Drink this. Water's no good.
Just here, everywhere.
Everywhere. Yeah, you never know where the toxins are going to creep in.
Okay. Step 1. Climate plans are nonsense, but read them anyway. You likely won't find many solutions worth fighting for in these documents, but they nonetheless will provide you with an inventory of greenhouse gas emissions, and therefore some sense of what must be shut down. One interesting approach to take is to look at emissions in terms of economic activity that meets a real human need, and therefore should persist in some modified form, and what economic activity can simply be discarded. The Portland Climate Action Plan illustrates this point painfully well. It's a bizarre literary creation much more than a strategy to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The individual actions, if that's what we want to call them, in the plan would be extremely tedious to examine individually. But let's use the plan's 63 unique actions on transportation to illustrate the general uselessness of this particular document, and indeed all other instances of the experimental literary genre, sometimes called infographic techno-dystopianism and sometimes called climate planning. All but 9 of the Portland CAP's transportation items fall into 4 categories. 11 consist solely of expressing support for another plan or policy, for instance, support implementation of a federal fuel standard, right? Just supporting something that the federal government would do. 21 of these actions consist solely of other plans, putative measures, or planning processes and policies which do not currently exist. So, for instance, include carbon targets in update to Portland Transportation System Plan. 11 of this plan's actions are merely efforts to increase modeling accuracy or information availability for some aspect of the economy. So, for instance, make data available to improve real-time information about transportation options. Okay, and then 11 of these actions are sufficiently intangible to describe a tremendous range of actions or very conceivably none at all. So, for instance, maybe my favorite, recognize the role of goods delivery in supporting healthy, vibrant industrial districts, yeah? So what all of these items have in common is that they utterly fail to describe any concrete change in the physical world. This is not by accident, and it goes a long way toward explaining how polities like California and Oregon, and cities like Portland and Seattle, have spent decades releasing climate plans describing declining emissions, while actual emissions, here in corporeal reality, continue to rise. The remaining 9 items in the Portland CAP's transportation section are, while tangible, simply ridiculous. Things like smart traffic lights, which the plan's authors, perhaps mercifully, have neglected to associate with any quantitative measure of emissions decline. But even if the actual strategies in climate plans are ridiculous, reading them will give you a sense of what strategies are really necessary. Probably most importantly, they will give you a detailed emissions inventory. So if you live in a progressive polity, read its climate plan. If you don't, there may be no climate plan. If that's the case, I recommend reading one that applies to an area similar to where you live, and also just looking at greenhouse gas inventory protocols. There are many out there, including some that were developed by the federal government to be applied by like cities and states and counties. So they contain really explicit instruction for how to look at a political unit and inventory its greenhouse gases, looking at economic data, things like that.
Yeah, you never know where the toxins are going to creep in. My aunt lived in a house that was built on a hazardous waste dump. Last April, she had a baby, and it was born with no ears.
No ears.
Okay, step 2. Recognize that for all the complexity of the economy, its physical infrastructure is very finite. On April 21st, 2019, some people blockaded the train tracks leading to a facility that transports tar sands oil, transferring it off of train cars and onto ships. The facility was located in a major industrial corridor in northwest Portland on the Willamette River, populated by many similarly dubious enterprises. Let's use this particular blockade and the strategies associated with it as the model for a much more general political program. The first point I want to make about this blockade is one of scale. Faced with the reality of ecological collapse already well underway, it's difficult to see the point in taking any particular action toward any finite goal. I think this is a consequence of how the liberal and progressive establishment has framed climate action as a set of manipulations of end uses rather than origins. If the problem is burning of transportation fuel, they insist the answer must be to give developers money for compact development and hope people drive less as a result, rather than simply ceasing the flow of transportation fuel. Okay, but all of Portland's gasoline comes from one pipeline, which originates at a refinery in Anacortes, Washington. There's a valve on this pipeline. What's a good rate of reduction in emissions? I like 10% a year. We could take the Portland Climate Action Plan approach, smart traffic lights, whatever that means, financial incentives for developers, commissions to study expanding public transportation, etc., and see where that goes. Or we could just close the valve 10% per year. We might call this latter approach a climate policy. We might call the approaches described in the Climate Action Plan adaptations to climate policy. Those in power have very deliberately confused adaptations to climate policy for climate policy itself. But even still, as ice shelves the size of states plummet into the acidifying ocean and forests burn off more carbon than they store, it can seem a little pointless to win victories at the scale of Portland, Oregon, even if the victories are of the truly transformational variety. But the point about the pipeline applies well beyond the boundaries of the city and the emissions that the boundaries of the city represent. Fossil fuels are transported by 4 different modes: road, pipeline, train, and ship. Preventing their transport at any point in these networks is just as good as preventing it anywhere else. The facility that was blockaded in April 2019 transports crude oil to refineries all over the West Coast. The transportation networks that run through the city are responsible for coal burned in China, lumber sold in Arizona, dynamite used to blow the tops off of mountains in West Virginia, and ships used to offshore drill for oil in the Arctic. And there aren't viable alternatives to pipelines, railroads, and rivers. One can't simply circumvent Portland by any of these means. So radical transformations at a very local scale can have a global impact.
No ears.
Yeah, I know these people who had a baby that was born with 2 rows of teeth on top.
All right, number 3. Communicate an explicit, concrete vision for declining emissions to zero. When the blockade was initiated, a small subset of those involved sent a communication to the city council and mayor of Portland, as well as to the media, announcing the rezoning of the industrial corridor. For years, the city government had been claiming there was nothing it could do about this oil transloading facility. The powerful, when faced with something they don't want to do, often claim they are powerless. We demonstrated an extremely simple action that would end the facility's existence with the application of an existing policy mechanism. Forest Park, the nation's largest urban forest, is the result of zoning, as is the industrial nightmare immediately adjacent to it, in which the facility that we blockaded is situated. So the actual work involved in this project consisted of reading through the zoning code, which is well over 1,000 pages, but the vast majority of it was mercifully irrelevant. Clicking a few buttons in Photoshop to replace one color with another on an existing zoning map, and writing a few paragraphs describing the allowed uses in the zoning designations. So we said in our communication with the city and with the media, as reflected on our revised zoning map, the base zone designation for the Willamette River Northwest Industrial Corridor, currently occupied by a number of bulk fossil fuel terminals, heavy manufacturing sites, and a major railroad yard, has been changed from 140, Employment and Industrial Zone, to 100, Open Space Zone. The previously allowed use categories of warehouse and freight movement, wholesale sales, industrial service, bulk fossil fuel terminal, and railroad yards are now prohibited. The manufacturing and production use, which is currently allowed, becomes a limited conditional use under the new designation. This type of communication achieves a few different things. Oh, and by the way, I mean, if you want to see the map, go to the website and read the piece, but the description is pretty sufficient. There's like some blotches that are one color in the previous one, and they're a different color in the one we sent out. Okay. So this type of communication achieves a few different things. Probably most importantly, it communicates an explicit vision for taking out a very significant portion of the city's contribution to the ecological crisis with one very palpably simple action. Contrary to everything found in the Kafkaesque, I guess I'll use that term, labyrinth of institutional climate planning, this action is easy to describe in concrete terms and easy for people to mentally model, based as it is on an understanding of finite infrastructure rather than the infinite complexity of end uses like liberal climate policy wants us to constantly be thinking of. It's almost impossible to overstate the extent to which climate politics are intransigent in part because people simply cannot imagine a world without the destructive enterprises on which our lives are currently based. So tangibly communicating this world is primary among the tasks and burdens of the ecological revolutionary, or however one chooses to consider themselves.
Jeez, some kind of monster.
Yeah, just think, by the year 2000, it'll be one big chemical wasteland.
All right, step 4. Never be agnostic on the relationship between your climate policy platform and the struggle for power. So another important aspect of this blockade and its associated communication is that we told of a policy change rather than asking for one. To say, we are enforcing this policy change with a blockade, while communicating in the terms of actual policy mechanisms to actual policymakers, is to begin establishing the foundations of a parallel institution, and thus of the kind of wholesale sociopolitical transformation one might call revolutionary. One of the ways I find easiest to convince people who don't identify as revolutionary of the necessity of revolutionary transformation is to talk about the archaic, outmoded nature of existing institutions and protocols. Since it's been in the news so much, the Supreme Court and the fucking Constitution are two great examples. The idea that a tiny cabal of wizened elders should consult a document written hundreds of years ago in ornate fucking calligraphy on parchment, no less, right? And consult that document for guidance on nuclear energy, electronic mass surveillance, climate change, and a host of other issues that simply didn't exist when the document was written. Like the fact that they should do this in ritual robes is as absurd a paradigm for establishing the terms on which a society operates as one could hope to encounter. So faced with the reality of institutions which aren't viable, we should simply make institutions that are. And with respect to the climate crisis, one particularly noteworthy archaism is the lack in almost every political jurisdiction of a climate department. I mean, considering the minutiae of government activity that does need a dedicated department, municipal elections bureaus, parks and recreation agencies, and so on, it's truly ridiculous for progressive politicians to promise to completely restructure every aspect of the economy to respect ecological limits without some kind of staffed, funded entity dedicated to doing so. Thus, in some sense, the work of writing and enforcing your own climate policy is the work of a parallel institution, but in some sense, the work really has no parallel. It's an act of establishing and modeling a necessary reality. And the creation of such dual power situations is, of course, the work of broader social transformation, without which climate survival is impossible. Political reality and physical reality have nothing to do with one another. There is real power in staking out a position that acknowledges physical reality at the expense of political reality and simply declaring the position legitimate. I've written in the past about the Earth First Wilderness proposal of the 1980s. Like me with my zoning map, these agitators simply put a bunch of big black blotches on a map of the United States and said, I imagine with some glee, we're fighting for these areas to be off limits to all development and for existing development to be decommissioned. And I mean, like some of these wilderness areas went through major cities and stuff, right? So the map terrified and enraged conservatives, resource extractive industries, and respectable environmentalists alike. But by the end of the 1990s, the areas of federal lands off limits to roads and resource extraction looked a lot more like the Earth First map than anyone else's map from the 80s. And so note that this is also how the right has steadily been accruing power for quite a while now. Not by appealing to common values, not by meeting people where they're at, but by taking positions that are shocking and unrelentingly maintaining them through all the enraged discourse until they start to seem normal or viable or whatever, right? If people are outraged by your policies, you're doing something right. Every time they reference you in horror, they give you a bigger platform. Every time they describe you as a threat to their way of life, or Christianity, or America, or the cautious deliberative nature of the Democratic Party, or fucking whatever, they make you a more serious and relevant aspect of the political landscape.
Yeah, just think, by the year 2000, it'll be one big chemical wasteland.
Yeah, all contaminated creek with gross bubbling vines hanging off of dead trees.
Number 5. Make an inventory of basic human needs and appeal to people's desire for stability and security. People are witnessing the collapse of their civilization and are justifiably scared that food will soon not be on grocery store shelves, that marauding bands will soon roam the streets, and all the rest. This can make an otherwise compelling climate strategy seem unviable. Again, I think this is because of how climate policy has been framed by liberal environmental groups and policymakers, as something to worry about when we have our basic needs met, which will allow us to keep living essentially the same lives, minus all the destruction. In reality, the Venn diagram of measures to stay within climate limits and measures to adapt to climate breakdown is one of two mostly overlapping circles. It was never true that stepping off this catastrophic ecological trajectory would happen with consumerism intact. What is needed in order to avoid ecological collapse, and in the case of ecological collapse, is a local system that meets basic needs, a way to produce enough food to feed people near to where those people live, a way to distribute that food to them, enough local renewable energy to maintain some of the truly essential functions electricity enables, some medical clinics, etc. Fortuitously, this is the same infrastructure that is needed to survive some of the other myriad crises with which the ecological crisis is converging. It's what you also want when the right-wing death squads are bombing electrical substations to punish the leftists of Portland, or when Amazon is the last remaining distributor of food in the market economy and they start charging $200 for a loaf of bread. The desire for radical social transformation often has conflict as its only really publicly visible manifestation. And the notable exception there are mutual aid projects, which are hugely important both for meeting people's immediate needs and for shifting perceptions of possible social relations. And this general premise can be applied to establishing the infrastructure to anticipate crisis as well as to respond to it. This kind of work complements the work of inventorying the infrastructure of emissions and making an explicit plan to shut it down. It's the work of establishing what, out of the myriad useless or at least far from essential activities that fossil fuels support, is actually necessary for survival and well-being. Simultaneously, it's a subversion of the monetary exchanges on which our current way of life is based. So a simple version of a project like this would be to draw whatever arbitrary lines one wishes on a map and call it a neighborhood, right? The criterion of all points being in convenient walking distance might be a good one to apply. And then an inventory of basic needs can be made based on the population. one could look at existing food production that is close by and try to imagine what agreements and logistics would need to exist to keep enough food coming into the neighborhood to feed everyone. And, in the case of Portland, Oregon does produce a lot more calories than it consumes. And a lot of that food production is like really reasonably close to Portland. And there's a bunch of agricultural potential that isn't being utilized within and kind of like right around the city. So, like that inventory might, if you took, I don't know, the neighborhood I stay in when I'm in Portland, the Hawthorne neighborhood, if you like took that neighborhood, like I said, drew some arbitrary lines on a map, and then you tried to figure out like how far one would have to go and to whom to feed that neighborhood. I think that the results really might not be that bleak. They might actually be pretty decent. So anyway, a similar exercise could be taken for local renewable energy, thinking not in terms of what would replace all the energy currently consumed in a neighborhood, a goal that is neither realistic nor remotely desirable, but in terms of what configurations of infrastructure like solar gardens or even just rooftop energy production could sustain, say, the internet, some medical devices, keeping some of the lights on some of the time, that sort of thing. All the trends are converging on a general ecological collapse in the 2020s, including the collapse of the food system. When food production is constrained to significantly lower levels, the power structure will simply adjust supply lines to the best of its ability, and this ability will be surprisingly minimal, as we've all seen in the COVID crisis, especially its early phases. And the power structure will begin raising costs dramatically, intensifying existing dynamics such that even relatively affluent people will go hungry. So circumventing the market and having our own infrastructure of distribution will be essential for survival. Again, the same measures are necessary to both prevent and endure the apocalypse. Projects like this are also cases where abandoning the penchant for specialized language that is so endemic to so many political circles could be really beneficial. In preparation for an action camp, a friend of mine once made a Facebook event with the title, "Freaking Out About Climate Change and Preparing to Do Something About It." And this event generated more interest more quickly than the vast majority of social media outreach efforts I've been a part of. And I think that this was largely because of the concrete, intuitively comprehensible language. If one is organizing to make a neighborhood more self-reliant, I think flyers that say, "Let's plan how we'll feed ourselves when the grocery store shelves are bare," is a lot more effective than flyers that say, like, "Planning for local resilience, making infrastructural, cultural, and organizational connections," or whatever.
Yeah, all contaminated and creepy with gross bubbling vines hanging off of dead trees.
All the mutes be roaming around bumping into each other.
Number 6, fight the culture war you can win. What we can ultimately appeal to is people's desire for freedom. There were numerous cases of early colonists abandoning European civilization to live with native people. There are no documented cases of the reverse happening. Our evolved psychological needs for interpersonal connection, competence, and authenticity are needs which consumer civilization militates against. The radical transformations that are necessary to shift the ecological trajectory are also the only realistic paths away from varieties of misery that are fundamental and ubiquitous to living in this society. This fact makes the liberal obsession with claiming that we can live essentially the same lives but somehow live them within climate limits all the more baffling. Such claims acknowledge neither physical nor social reality. The kinds of superficial changes proposed by adherents of the existing social order. Imagine if your job racing against a robot in the Amazon fulfillment center produced net zero emissions by 2050. Promises more suffering to people who have already exceeded their capacity for suffering. But if we go a little deeper, If we pursue changes that actually have any geophysical salience, we're suddenly talking about living in ways that meet our basic psychological needs. We're talking about things like not going to work. There are significant trade-offs involved with stepping off the treadmill of consumerism. Consumer pleasures are, after all, pleasant. But the part where you get to step off the treadmill is nice too. The trap this economy has laid for us involves the same biological processes involved in addiction to substances. You do something miserable with most of your day, and then you come home and partake in various gratuitous pleasures to cope with the misery. The trajectory away from extinction is one where we get to feel better about what we actually do with ourselves. We get more agency. We get to feel like what we do might actually matter. But we also may not have as many artisan ice cream shops all over the place. I'm using a somewhat Portland-specific illustration here, but this can be easily generalized. So this is a winnable war. A relatively small proportion of the population is ever going to be moved by ecological messaging per se. I say this as someone who devoted his life to ecological interventions after a teenage revelation in the forest, so I'm emphatically in that small proportion. But that fact makes me all the more confident in the assessment that most people simply aren't wired that way. And at this point, the empirical reality of how far into collapse we are with this little meaningful engagement is ample evidence that ecological messaging has its limits, as does all the green jobs messaging that liberal environmental groups use. Fuck your job has a fundamental appeal that we will guarantee that there will always be some job for you, only it will be good for the planet, utterly lacks. In the city of Portland, we could get somewhere by promoting a political program that will allow us to go back to spending most of our fucking time making art, and will save the world. In other words, part of the cultural and psychological appeal of a political program to avoid extinction is in avoiding the misery of work in this economy, but part of the appeal is in pursuing the joy of work outside of this economy. If we take work in a broad sense to refer to whatever specialized tasks people feel it's their mandate to perform. One of the great tragedies of the consumer economy is all the geniuses who never get to write their mathematical proofs or synthesize proteins that produce electricity or whatever because they're too busy chopping garnishes for the lunches of computer programmers who are also geniuses who never get to put their technical acumen to any greater purpose than selling advertising. What we're selling is a chance for people to do their most vital, interesting, and important work. And this doesn't just relate to highly specialized tasks. Whenever I've not made ends meet with writing and organizing, which has been a considerable majority of the time, I've fallen back on line cooking and construction labor. At this point, it's somewhere between difficult and impossible to imagine working any more jobs in these areas. But I can't overstate how much I actually miss both these activities and wish I could apply my skills to something broadly socially useful outside of a job context. If it was my role to feed my neighborhood in a non-commercial setting, I would cheerfully wake up at 4 a.m. to start cracking eggs and chopping potatoes, as I've often done at resistance kitchens and in collective houses. I love to cook for people. I take pride in my ability to create meals out of sparse ingredients. I just can't walk through the doors of another fucking cooking job. By appealing to people's desire to do meaningful work and avoid meaningless work and apply their specialized skills and talents, we fight a culture war that has been raging for centuries, that people have always fought intuitively, as the rich have sought to ensnare us in their economy.
All the mutants be roaming around bumping into each other.
Yeah, my dad was in Vietnam and he had some of that Agent Orange crap dumped on him. Had some adverse effects.
Like what?
His fingernails fell out.
And number 7. Don't wait until you have the perfect coalition, nor the perfect political opportunity. The inability of establishment liberals, whether in environmental nonprofits or in public office, To articulate a set of social and economic changes compatible with ecological limits is not surprising, because such changes would be radical and liberals are inexorably wedded to the status quo. However, it is undeniably true that grassroots political actors have likewise failed in this regard. In both cases, the explicit justification is that they are waiting for some set of supposedly necessary conditions to be met. Within institutional politics, whether we're talking about international climate negotiations or municipal policy, everyone is always waiting for sufficient initiative to exist in other polities before the difficulty and risk of enacting real climate policies can be undertaken. At the grassroots level, the perfect coalition must exist, supposedly representing a massive proportion of the population, and they must agree on every aspect of the policies one pursues. Most of the grassroots political actors who have offered an opinion on policies that I've promoted in the course of my organizing have told me they didn't have sufficient support from some particular demographic or another, and thus it was not only ill-advised but ultimately oppressive to promote them. All of these notions, these variations on waiting until the right conditions are met to begin proposing concrete changes, are based on a fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of power on the one hand, and a fundamental misunderstanding of the role of imagination in political change on the other. And like the nature of parallelism, the need for pluralism. It would be necessary to consult with as many different groups of people as possible if one had any real shot at enacting meaningful policies through institutional channels. So like the Bernie Sanders version of the Green New Deal, which is such an incredibly broad umbrella term for such a totally heterogeneous set of policies. But the Bernie Sanders version of it is the only policy, like set of policies that I've ever seen really that were like in any way commensurate with the nature of the climate crisis and actually like pretty concretely addressed most emissions sectors in a pretty aggressive way. And, you know, like Bernie Sanders, as much as a lot of us saw what ended up happening coming a long way off, you know, like it was like a meaningful shot at taking that office. And so like, I would say that in that case, I assume that he consulted with all kinds of people and, you know, had all kinds of committees representing, you know, like assessing the equity implications, like, you know, like all that stuff. And that's like necessary and right. But if you're doing grassroots, like political work and, you know, there's not like you're not imminently going to seize like federal office or anything like that. In those cases, I just really don't think that waiting until you have the perfect coalition is coherent. So I would say that because no one does have a real shot at enacting like a truly meaningful set of policies through institutional channels right now, articulating policies must be thought of as an exercise in changing the political conditions in which policies are made rather than an exercise in actual policy making. And that's the sense in which I just think it gives one broad creative license. So moreover, the notion that a broad consensus on climate policy is going to emerge from a vacuum, from the abstract question, what should we do about climate, being presented to, you know, refinery workers and people of color who live in the pollution streams those refinery workers produce. This notion is absurd. The only conceivable way for a broad consensus to emerge is for many different people to explicitly articulate their different visions, and for points of convergence and divergence to be sought out and assessed among them. What happens when we stop waiting to have the perfect coalition reach the perfect consensus is that we start having a rich landscape to draw options from, rather than no landscape like we essentially have right now. Everyone should have their own climate policies. You should have yours, and I should have mine. It's not the work of those in power. It's not the work of a coalition which has yet to really come into existence. It's your problem and mine. This is the essential, creative, courageous work before us.
His fingernails grow out, lots of sexual appetite, and this.
Okay, we are going to call that an episode, I suppose. And, like 5 days from now, perhaps, I'll have an episode about negative emissions, about greenhouse gas removal protocols, and why I think it is time for radical movements, grassroots movements, to start having to start becoming more familiar with the wide range of different protocols that exist, or at least exist on paper, and to start really having some opinions about some of those, and to start maybe advocating for some of those. So until that time, thank you so much for listening, and we will talk again soon.
Yeah, just think by the year 2000, it'll be one big chemical wasteland. Yeah, just think by the year 2000, it'll be one big chemical wasteland.